In the summer of 1946, the United States government sent the largest military expedition in Antarctic history to the bottom of the world, and then quietly stopped talking about it. 4,700 men, 13 ships, 33 aircraft, 1 aircraft carrier, 1 submarine, 2 icebreakers, and enough cameras to fill a Hollywood studio. The official name was the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program, 1946 to 1947. The code name was Operation Highjump, and the man in charge was Rear Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd, the most decorated polar explorer in American history, a man who had already made 4 separate Antarctic expeditions and once overflown the South Pole at midnight in November 1929. The expedition was planned to last 6 to 8 months. It lasted fewer than 3. That gap is where this story begins. Let's start with what they said publicly, because even that version is remarkable. On August 26, 1946, Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Chief of Naval Operations, the man who had commanded the entire Pacific Fleet against Japan, stood before the press and announced Operation Highjump. He described it as a training exercise, a way to test ships and planes and new helicopters in extreme cold, a chance to expand geographic knowledge. Straightforward, reasonable. A nation with thousands of soldiers and sailors fresh from the war, now needing something to do, being sent to one of the last unexplored places on Earth. 3 naval groups departed from separate ports. The Central Group left Norfolk, Virginia on January 2, 1947. The Eastern Group, built around the seaplane tender USS Pine Island, rendezvoused at Peter Island near 0 degrees longitude by December 23, 1946. The Western Group, built around the USS Currituck, reached the Balleny Islands in the Western Pacific sector. The force was split across an entire hemisphere of Antarctic coast. The Central Group punched through 650 miles of pack ice in 18 days just to reach the Bay of Whales. The Norwegian trawlers they passed on the way reported that the ice was the heaviest it had been in more than 40 years. The task force did it anyway. By January 15, 1947, the Central Group had established Little America 4 on the Ross Ice Shelf, the 4th American base at that site, and the most heavily supplied. The base immediately began sending aircraft outward in radial patterns across the continent. 28 photographic flights, 49,000 photographs, 1.5 million square miles of Antarctica photographed from the air for the first time in history. Areas of coastline that had never appeared on any map. A coal deposit large enough to matter. Soil and water samples from a continent that had never been studied at that scale. And one discovery so strange it still carries the name of the Navy pilot who found it, the Bunger Hills, an ice-free zone of blue lakes and bare bedrock in East Antarctica, spotted by pilot David Bunger in late January 1947. He described it as appearing first like a mirage, then like something that had no business being there. His exact words in the Los Angeles Times in 1948. When I first saw the land, it was a dark patch that might have been a distant mountain, and I thought it must be a mirage. Within a half hour of flying, we knew that it was real, but incredible at the same time. Ice, dark water, no snow. The expedition had barely started its mapping program when things started going wrong. On December 30th, 1946, a Martin PBM-5 flying boat called George I crashed during a blizzard on Thurston Island. 3 men died in the crash: Ensign Maxwell A. Lopez, Aviation Radio Man First Class, Wendell K. Henderson, and Aviation Radio Man First Class Frederick W. Williams. 6 survivors walked 9 to 10 miles across Antarctic ice to reach the shore because no aircraft could land to pick them up. The area was so difficult to find again that rescue pilots gave it a name, the Phantom Coast. Their bodies, Lopez, Henderson, Williams, still lie on Thurston Island today. No recovery attempt has ever succeeded. On January 21st, 1947, Seaman Vance N. Woodall died on the Ross Ice Shelf when a piece of heavy roller equipment used to pave an ice runway for aircraft came down on him during unloading operations. His crewmate, Edward Beardsley, later said it was the worst memory of his entire life. 2 helicopters were lost to the ice. The submarine assigned to the task force, the USS Senate, encountered ice so thick that it threatened to crush the hull. The Senate was forced to withdraw entirely. And then, in late February 1947, without warning and weeks ahead of any original schedule, the entire operation was called off. The official reason, worsening weather and the early approach of Antarctic winter, which is possible. The continent's summer window is short, but the mission had been planned to last 6 to 8 months. It ended after fewer than 3. The ice conditions in 1947, as recorded by those same Norwegian trawlers, were the worst in 4 decades. The weather deteriorated faster than predicted. Those are facts. What makes historians and researchers keep returning to this operation is not the supernatural layer that conspiracy theories added later. And we are going to address that layer directly because it matters, but the documented peculiarities that the government itself left on the record. If you value documented Cold War history and real geopolitical facts like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work, and drop a comment telling us which city you are watching from. This script is built on primary sources, including the peer-reviewed paper by Colin Summerhays and Peter Beeching, Hitler's Antarctic Base, The Myth and the Reality, published in Polar Record, Volume 43, Issue 224, in 2007, the only academic paper specifically examining the declassified records of Operation Highjump against the competing myths. It is the kind of source that most documentaries never read. We did. There's also the research of historian Deanne Olsen Belanger, whose book Deep Freeze, The United States, the International Geophysical Year, and the Origins of Antarctica's Age of Science, published by the University Press of Colorado in 2006, remains the most comprehensive account of how Operation Highjump shaped every American Antarctic mission that followed it. Now back to the information. Here is what Belanger told the Smithsonian in 2007. The Navy had classified orders, separate from the public mission statement, to do everything possible to establish a basis for an American land claim in Antarctica. Not just map it, claim it. That objective was never disclosed publicly until researchers found it in the archives decades later. And here is another layer. The operation was originally promoted as a climate study assigned to the National Weather Bureau. The Bureau then handed it almost entirely to the Navy, Army, Marines, and Coast Guard. Congress, when it approved the funding, made clear that regardless of how it started, this was a naval operation. Military interests dominated. The expedition included Marine combat troops and a submarine. No weather study required a submarine in the Weddell Sea. The Cold War context explains much of this. In 1946, the Soviet Union had emerged from World War II as the dominant land power on the Eurasian continent, and the United States had atomic weapons, but was beginning to realize that distance alone no longer meant safety. The polar routes, over the North Pole and potentially the South, were the shortest paths between the Soviet Union and the American mainland. Byrd himself had first flown over the North Pole in 1926. He understood better than almost anyone alive what polar air routes meant for strategic planning. Which brings us to the interview on March 5th, 1947. Aboard the expedition's command ship, the USS Mount Olympus, somewhere between Antarctica and Chile, Byrd sat down with Lee Van Atta of International News Service. The interview was published that day in El Mercurio, the Chilean national newspaper. Byrd's words, accurately translated from the original Spanish: "The cruel reality is that in case of a new war, the United States could be attacked by planes flying over one or both poles." He was talking about Soviet bombers. The polar routes were the fastest paths from Russian territory to American cities. This is not mysterious. It is precisely the logic that led the United States military to establish the Strategic Air Command in 1946, the same year as Operation Highjump. SAT bombers eventually flew continuous patrol flights along the northern borders of Alaska, Canada, and Greenland throughout the Cold War to deter exactly the kind of attack Byrd was describing in that interview. But by the time that interview circulated through translation and retranslation over the following decades, versions of it had mutated. One widely shared version replaced hostile planes with flying objects which could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. That version has no source. It is a fabrication documented by researchers who tracked down the original Spanish text and compared it directly with the manipulated English version. This is where the documented history of Operation Highjump ends and the mythology begins. And the mythology is important to understand, not because it is true, but because of how specifically it was constructed and what it replaced. The mythology goes like this. The Nazis, before and during World War II, established a secret base in Antarctica in a region they called Neuschwabenland, the German name for Drowning Maudland, which a German expedition had mapped in 1938 and 1939. In this version, the base was real, operational, and defending itself with advanced technology. Operation Highjump was a military assault on the base. The expedition was repulsed with heavy casualties. Byrd's early withdrawal was the result of a military defeat. The whole thing was covered up. Here is what is true about the German Antarctic expedition of 1938 and 1939. It happened. The ship Schwabenland did map roughly 250,000 square kilometers of Antarctica from the air, dropping metal darts with swastikas to mark claimed territory. Admiral Karl Dönitz did make statements suggesting Antarctica held strategic value. These are in the historical record. Here is what is also true. The peer-reviewed investigation by Summerhays and Beeching in 2007 examined every available record, German naval archives, declassified American documents, and the geographic realities of Antarctic logistics, and found no evidence that a permanent German base existed. The two German U-boats, U-530 and U-977, which surrendered in Argentina in July and August of 1945, and were used to anchor the story, could not have physically reached Antarctica given their fuel capacity and their stated trajectories. The submarine, U-530's Argentine Navy manifest, does not include the name of the person later claimed to have been on board as an eyewitness. The fiction was assembled piece by piece. Ladislas Szabo, a Hungarian exile in Argentina, published the first version in Buenos Aires newspaper La Critica on July 16, 1945, before the war was even officially over. Over the following decades, the story grew, absorbed the U-boat surrenders, then absorbed Operation Highjump, then absorbed Byrd's mistranslated interview. By the 1970s, there were books. By the 2000s, there were German documentary films. By the 2010s, there were hundreds of YouTube channels. The actual classified portions of Operation Highjump, the sovereignty objective, the military contingency planning, the reconnaissance work along Antarctic coastlines, were far less exciting than Antarctic Nazi bases. They were also real. The real story is this. The United States sent the largest polar military expedition in history to Antarctica in 1946 because the world had just reorganized itself around two superpowers, and no one knew yet where the next war would come from or which direction the missiles would fly. The poles mattered. The shortest route from Moscow to Washington crossed the Arctic. Antarctica was the mirror image problem. Who would control the southern approaches? Uranium deposits had been found in parts of the continent. Coal had been confirmed, and the Soviet Union had not yet committed to staying out. What Byrd came back with was 49,000 photographs, 1.5 million square miles of mapped territory, a coal deposit, and a classified report that guided where American research stations were built for the next decade. The Bunker Hills Oasis, found by David Bunker on that mission, was used by planners when they sited Antarctic stations during the International Geophysical Year of 1957 and 1958. That is a direct line from Operation Highjump to the permanent international scientific presence on the continent today. The documentary the Navy made about the expedition, The Secret Land, shot entirely by military photographers and narrated by Robert Taylor, Robert Montgomery, and Van Heflin, three Hollywood actors who had all served in the Navy during World War II, won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature at the 21st Oscar ceremony in 1948. The film was shown in movie theaters across America. The Navy wanted the public to see it. What they did not show was the classified sovereignty agenda. What they did not discuss was why the departure happened months ahead of schedule. The gap between what was shown and what was classified was narrow enough that it did not require a conspiracy to explain, but wide enough that once people started asking, the space filled quickly. Byrd died on March 11, 1957 in Boston, Massachusetts, at the age of 68. No confirmed record from his lifetime describes him discussing flying objects, underground civilizations, or Antarctic Nazi technology. The quotes that circulate online claiming otherwise were published after his death, attributed to journals and radio interviews that no archive has ever verified. What Byrd did do, consistently on the record, was argue that Antarctica was strategically important and that the United States needed to treat it seriously. He was right. The Antarctic Treaty of December 1, 1959, demilitarized the continent and dedicated it to peaceful scientific research. 12 nations signed it. The Soviet Union signed it. The framework it created has held for more than 60 years, longer than almost any international arms agreement in history. Operation Highjump is documented in the National Archives. The photographs are there. The casualty reports are there. The mission logs are there. The classified sovereignty objective, once secret, was declassified and is now in the public record. What is also in the National Archives in a crew profile from one of the surviving sailors is Edward Beardsley's account of January 21st, 1947, the worst day of his life, the day Vance Woodall died under a machine on the Ross ice shelf paving a runway the expedition would use for fewer than 6 weeks before turning around and going home. The three men who died in the George I crash on December 30th, 1946, are still on Thurston Island. In December 2004, a team attempted to locate the wreckage. The Phantom Coast earned its name. No recovery.